Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and it's a Friday evening, which means I'm joined by Aaron Bastani. Aaron, how are you doing? You ready for the weekend?
I'm doing very well, Michael. I like that fade into me. It's good to see you, and I do love our Friday shows. Can't wait to get started.
Yeah, the fade was good, wasn't it? What they used to do them on sort of the day-to-day, where you have sort of really bizarre ones, where you have like crossfades in shapes and stuff. We could really experiment with that. What we're going to be discussing tonight, I'll tell you. We speak to a humanitarian aid worker in Gaza about the complete siege on the Strip, which has been going on for 54 days now. Really disturbing interview, really important interview, I think. We'll also discuss the Billionaire push to privatise space. And we've got a really interesting clip for you with Dawn Butler debating the Supreme Court's ruling on gender. Next week, both Labour and the Tories look set to receive a shock from reform in the first set of major elections since Keir Starmer became Prime Minister. And there are 23 councils up for grabs in these elections, most of them in the traditional Tory shires and currently under Tory control. Labour-controlled Doncaster is also going to the polls. Kemi Badenoch, for her part, has suggested the Tories could lose every single one of those councils that they're contesting. She's likely intentionally setting her expectations or setting our expectations very low in an attempt to frame holding just one of them as a victory. She'd say, well, I said we'd lose all of them and we only lost 22 of them, right? This is expectation management, you might call it. You can see, though, why she might be pessimistic. Now, the last time these council seats were up for election, Boris Johnson was still riding high in the polls. It was before Partygate, and the Tories received 40% of the vote, with Labour on 30%. Now, polls this time around show the Tories with their support halved to 20%, and Reform coming first with 25% support. Labour are on just 23%. The most high-profile contests of the night won't be for those councils, though, but rather one Westminster by-election and votes for 6 mayors. So we'll start with the mayors. Greater Lincolnshire is for the first time electing a mayor. Andrea Jenkins, you might remember her as a Conservative MP. She's now a Reform member. She's way ahead in the polls. A Reform candidate is also ahead in the polls to become the first mayor of Hull and East Yorkshire. In both of those races, Reform are ahead in the polls by more than 14 points, which means Farage will presumably be happy. And Farage's party are also the favourites to win the Westminster by-election in the Cheshire seat of Runcorn. Now, this seat was a Labour seat until the incumbent punched a constituent. Never a good idea. Farage has been very active campaigning in the constituency.
Mr Farage, how's the campaign going? Channel 4 News.
I think pretty well. Obviously it's Labour's 16th safest seat, but I tell you something, we're giving them a run for their money. There's no question about that.
Do you think they'll win?
Don't know, but I think it's very close.
I think he wants you to think it's close. I think he might be a bit more confident than he's making out there. Aaron, you've just come back from Runcorn, and we're going to show a couple of clips from that trip in a moment. First, though, can you give me the big picture? How much do these elections, not just the by-election, but also the mayoral election and the local elections, how much do these matter?
They're hugely important. We tend to think of local elections as not really being that big a feature in the UK political landscape. However, despite low turnout, generally speaking, about 30% of people turn out in local elections. In some wards, it's much lower. I've seen wards in local elections where you have below 15% turnout. Despite that, though, and despite, of course, councillors and local authorities having less power than national government, it's really, really, really important, I think decisively important, because this is very much the springboard for Reform if they want to become a truly national party ahead of the general election in 2028 or 2029. To be competitive in a by-election in what is the 16th safest seat for the Labour Party is a huge deal. We're less than a year into the Starmer government, and they're looking to pick up not 1 but 2 mayoralties. They might pick up none, but they're in contention for 2. So between the by-election, potentially winning local authorities, not just picking up councillors, but maybe being in control of authorities. Again, may or may not happen. But if the other side of this, they've won a by-election, they've won a mayor, and they're in control of a local authority, alongside those now 4 MPs they have at Westminster, they are very much entitled to say that they are a national political party, very much on the up, and importantly, taking votes from both the Conservative Party and Labour.
Let's look at a couple of those clips that you made up in Runcorn yesterday.
Labour have so lost in touch with working people. I mean, I know you're kind of to the left, but the treatment of working people has been appalling.
What stands out in regards to Labour's treatment of working people in the last 12 months? Not the last, the Blair government or Brown, but in the last 12 months, what really stands out for you?
Well, if you can't afford to heat your home, you can't afford to pay the rates. I don't know what the percentage the rates went up, but it was pretty big. Heating bills, they must have doubled in the last, whenever. Thanks, boss. We live in a big old shed of a house. We can't afford to heat it. I mean, literally, we just couldn't afford the bills. Our rates are $3,000 a year, just for a 3-bed detached. It's colossal money. I know most of it goes on social care. I think that's the big expenditure for council is social care. Then there's $6 billion for illegal migrants. I don't think many people are very happy about it. I don't know what you think about it, whether you think we should pay for illegal migrants. I'm not very keen.
Why are you edging towards the Reform candidate?
Well, I think they're going to look after the place better. And I was disappointed that the Labour Party didn't give us the fuel allowance when they can keep thousands of migrants in hotels. And a friend of mine, she volunteers in the food bank in Warrington, and she recently had somebody go in and ask for food, clothes, and a SIM card. And she said, well, have you got a ticket? Apparently they need a ticket. He said, no. She said, well, I can't give them to you. She said, well, where are you staying? He was in a hotel at Woolston. So they want it all ways round. And this government's giving it them.
So that last lady you heard from, she went on to say she voted Labour at the last election, though before that she'd always been a Tory voter. You can see more of those interviews as part of a report from Aaron that we'll be putting out on Monday. Aaron, for now, talk to me. The cut to the winter fuel payment plus asylum seekers staying in hotels seems like a very toxic combination, sort of two stories which people are fitting together. Was that something you heard from more than those two people?
Everywhere. Migration and refugees, absolutely everywhere. Now, Runcorn and Helsby, which is that constituency, overwhelmingly white. But in a way, and I think this is sometimes lost in the debate, when a seat is more white British, white European, it makes recent arrivals, migrants, undocumented or just legal migration, it makes those people far more conspicuous. And I think that's really been lost in conversations about this stuff. So that sort of conversation was everywhere in regards to immigration, refugees, and so on. And unlike 10 months ago, Michael, this wasn't being done in broad strokes, This wasn't saying, I'm not racist, but I think migration can be good, but nothing like that. The words were being used were things like invasion, overtaking us, conquest, replacement. So a paradigmatically different kind of political rhetoric was being used to 1 year ago. Things have moved on at lightning pace. And I think, that's something that all of us on the left in particular are going to have to contend with.
What do you think's going on there? Do you have a theory as to how sort of the political debate may have changed sort of over the past, I suppose, year or so? Aaron's maybe gone to put his dog in a room. Is he back now, though? He is back. You put Gino...
Again, Michael,
you've locked up Gino somewhere.
Being very naughty.
I'll ask you again. My question was, do you have a theory as to why discourse might have changed since the general election, if you feel like people's views when it comes to migration might have hardened somewhat?
Well, I think in July 2024, the big story was that people had given up on the Conservative Party. That was the big story. Even people who were still going to vote for the Conservative Party had just given up on them. They don't think they're a serious party. They thought they'd been a disaster really for the post-COVID period. But actually, lots of people on reflection were saying the 14 years they've been in charge have been bad, right? Just net bad. And I think many people, right, especially in somewhere like Runcorn and Helsby, Many people thought, you know what, we'll give Labour a chance. Maybe there'll be something different. And they've been really let down. And that doesn't mean all those votes are left-wing, right? It doesn't mean all those votes are historically left-leaning, or that they love Novara media and that they share, the politics of you or I, or our viewers and our listeners. But they felt defeated, let down, and they thought there's still one more option here. It's the Labour Party. I very much see Labour in 2028, 2029 going to the exact same place as the Tories after 2019. Big mandate, promises of hope and change, and delivering very little. Defeat, disaster, decline. We don't really have a template for what comes after that. That second lady who I spoke to in that clip there, Michael, as you said, lifelong Tory voter. She had decided to vote Labour to back Starmer in that July general election. This was exactly the kind of voter that Morgan McSweeney, Keir Starmer based their strategy around for years. She said the minute she heard that the winter fuel allowance was being withdrawn from 10 million people, she regretted voting Labour. She said, I regretted it like nothing else. And I wonder, Michael, you might think that's a good or bad decision. It's raised very little money for the government. It's raised about, I think, 1.5 billion, something like that. I can't think of another political decision in my lifetime which has raised so little money and yet has cost the political party so much. And I think, a sensible Labour Party with intelligent people at its helm, after 4, 5, 6 weeks, would have taken a step back. They would have looked at the political damage it was leading to, and they would have reversed course. Now, that doesn't mean I think that we should be giving multimillionaires, the winter fuel allowance. I don't think that. I think change was necessary. But going from 12 million people being in receipt of it to just 2 million so quickly really upset a lot of people and, turned up the apple cart with regards to precisely the voters they were chasing, specifically floating Labour Tory voters who would be between, say, 50 and 75. They've lost those people. They've lost them. Most of them, I think, are now going to reform. And by the way, those kinds of voters are particularly important in somewhere like Runcorn, not a university town, slightly higher average age.
No, I totally agree with you on how stupid the winter fuel policy was. I think sort of some of the rhetoric around it was a bit overplayed. Sort of people saying people are going to freeze to death because of this. It did go to a lot of people who were relatively well off. Yes, they should have kept it going to more than just the sort of, was it sort of 12 or 20% of people who get the pension allowance. But yeah, I think the big story there is just how disastrous it was politically, the messaging, which is that we're taking this away from pensioners, who are the most important voting bloc in the country. They'd spent so long, right, saying we're going to be a bit more socially conservative because we recognise that pensioners, not young people in cities, they're the people who decide elections. And then the moment they get elected, they say, you know what we're going to do? We're going to cut the winter fuel payment from 80% of them. Completely bizarre. Completely bizarre. Although I say bizarre, it's obviously not because, this is how Rachel Reeves does politics, and Keir Starmer doesn't do politics at all. For Rachel Reeves, it is all just an accounting exercise. She would have looked at that. We've shown it before, actually. She was saying she wanted to do this in 2014 to take away the pensioners' winter fuel allowance. Now, as Aaron said, there is some arguments as to why it shouldn't be completely universal. You are paying it to lots of people who are relatively well off. You might say that that's fine. I was never outraged by it. The thing with universal benefits is it means it's easier to sort of keep support going for them, but you can see why a sort of penny pinching, I want our spending to be as efficient as possible, might have sort of picked that one out as one that looked a bit wasteful. But it was just the stupidest political decision, I think. I agree with you, Aaron. The stupidest political decision that has been made in a very long time for such a small amount of money, 1.4 billion or something. Let's turn to the other side of the political spectrum and discuss what is happening to the left of Labour. So nationally, the Greens are polling at 10%, which is 3% more than they got at last year's general election. And their big win could be in the race to be the West of England mayor. Their candidate is on 27% to Labour's 23%, so it's very close. The Greens here might be helped somewhat by recent controversies surrounding the incumbent in the job. Dan Norris, who was elected in 2021 as the Labour candidate, has since then been arrested over rape and child abuse allegations. He's been suspended from the Labour Party as a result. He was never going to be a candidate in this election because he was elected as a Labour MP at the last general election, and they have a rule now where you can't sort of stand to be a mayor when you are already an MP. But I think this probably is putting a bit of a shadow over Labour's campaign. We won't talk in detail about that because it's clearly a live case. Aaron, more generally, the Greens had a good general election last year. So going from 1 seat to 4 MPs seemed like, that was really the best they could have hoped for then. Feels like since then they've been treading water a bit. There hasn't been a breakout moment with the Labour Party sort of catastrophically unpopular. They're still only on 10%. What's going on?
Well, I think if they do win this Metro Mayor in the west of England, that would constitute a breakout moment, wouldn't it? I should say, in terms of Runcorn and Helsby yesterday, we've spoken about sort of more socially conservative, more right-wing voters. And I do think Reform will win that seat. There are still Labour voters there. They're not particularly optimistic about Keir Starmer. In some ways, those were the most interesting people to talk to, because the one thing they could say is give Labour time. How long is that really going to wash? But on the point of the Greens, I probably met, and I only spoke to about 70, 80 people, right? Is that statistically significant? No. But I spoke to more people who are planning to vote Green than were planning to vote Conservative, which I find really, really interesting. The Greens did actually pretty well in that seat of Runcorn in the last general election. They kept their deposit. They might get 10% in the by-election, which is not bad, given this was the 16th safest Labour seat. So they're still out there. I think their approach really means they tend to be hyper-local, very focused on local contests rather than the national, often mediatised debate. And look, that worked in the last general election. They quadrupled their number of MPs while not being that prominent, Reform style, in the press and on broadcast. I agree. I think personally that you can do both. But I do think winning the West of England mayoralty would be a really major moment for them. That said, it can be a poison chalice having the mayoralty, because when you control a council, you might have 30 councillors. That's 30 of your activists who are paid. That's a lot of people who can become parliamentary candidates. That you can build a really good local organisation. When you win a mayoralty, it's just one person, and actually they don't necessarily have that much power if the local council isn't aligned with them, if the local MPs aren't aligned with them. But it's going to be an interesting one if they do win there, because of course, for the Greens in Bristol, that's very much now their heartlands. They've got an MP there. I think they'll win 2 MPs there at least in the next general election. They've got a massive council group in the city of Bristol itself, and across the southwest, and the west, places like Stroud, bits of Somerset. They're doing really, really well. So I think this could be a major moment and a geographical concentration of the Greens. If they want to win any mayoralty anywhere in the country, Michael, it would be in the west of England. And first past the post rewards geographic concentration. That's why the Scottish National Party have really done very well out of it. And I think winning that mayoralty will start to figure more in that logic. The Greens will be thinking, yes, of course, we want to pick up seats in London. One amazing poll showing they might win in Tottenham. I don't think that's likely, but, perhaps. But besides the major cities, the west and southwest of England would begin to look like something of a Green Party heartland.
61 people were killed by Israeli airstrikes across the Gaza Strip on Thursday. Al Jazeera spoke to citizens who witnessed the attacks.
I was in the street and I was shocked to see the missiles hitting that building. I hurried there to help people. I recovered 4 body parts myself. I also recovered a baby from under the rubble, and this is his photo.
It's no safer here in Jabalia, where an Israeli missile crashed down near a police station.
Among the dead are women, children and old people. The Israelis hit the place with 2 missiles. Dozens of people got injured and the whole area was turned upside down. They waited till everyone got scared and went to the streets, then they fired the second missile. I didn't die today because after the first missile, I headed to a direction where the second missile didn't fall.
Alongside continued widespread bombings, Israel has maintained a complete siege on the Strip for the last 54 days. Now, that means no food, water, or medical supplies have been allowed into Gaza, threatening Gaza's 2 million residents with famine. To discuss the humanitarian catastrophe created by Israel, I spoke earlier today to Gavin Kelleher, an aid worker with the Norwegian Refugee Council, currently posted in Deir al-Balah in central Gaza.
The situation here in Gaza is incredibly dire at the moment. Hunger is setting in on a massive scale. Nothing has entered Gaza since the 2nd of March. There are a number of pressing humanitarian concerns, but primarily it's access to food. That is the big issue for people here. Most families are now surviving on a meal a day or less. Many of them are having to split that meal in half just to get through the day. People are selling their last remaining possessions, their clothes, trying to access remaining food stocks. But there simply isn't enough food in Gaza at this point, and the siege is continuing.
It's difficult to fathom almost that sort of you've got 2 million people living somewhere where they have no supplies have reached for 8 weeks now. And so I suppose, are people just running down stocks, which presumably weren't very high before the siege began, because obviously this is a place which has been subject to war for 18 months now?
So some people might still have some small reserves of food that they were able to accumulate during the ceasefire period, but for the majority of people, that is now exhausted. For many others, we've had 420,000 people displaced in the last month alone. Many of those are not able to carry anything with them when they move, particularly if they're supporting children or elderly family members. So a number of people now have nothing at all. They're surviving on begging from those around them, and the charity of others is now increasingly limited because nobody has anything to spare at this point, while around 1 million people are receiving around 1 meal a day from the community kitchens, which are still operating, but they are only about to operate for maybe another 7 days or so before even their stocks are exhausted. And then we really literally have nothing left to give people here.
Has there been any indication from, I suppose, the Israeli security service or the Israeli government that they have a timescale for planning to end this siege? Or is it something that I suppose you in the humanitarian community are just sort of considering could be indefinite?
We've received no messaging about when the siege will be lifted. We've continually been calling for the lifting of the siege. And of course, the restriction of humanitarian aid coming into Gaza is not new. It's never been at this level before. We're reaching unprecedented levels, being able to bring absolutely nothing in. But for the entire time of these hostilities, people in Gaza have been denied access to the amount of supplies that they need. Every single humanitarian need of a Palestinian in Gaza has been weaponized against them continuously. And humanitarian organizations like ours have had our hands tied, and we're prevented from bringing in what we need at the volume we need to people who need it. And now that's reached a level where we've got literally nothing left to give.
And does that mean literally that people are sort of coming to you? You're sort of well-known, well-respected international aid organization. People are coming to you saying, you know, we're desperate. We need food for our children, and you just say, well, we don't have any food. I mean, what's that like? Is that sort of have I described sort of an experience that you have?
Absolutely. So we have people knocking on the gates of the compound. We have people asking who's still able to deliver assistance. And it's not just food. There's also been a reduction in access to water because the way water is mostly produced in Gaza is it's turned from the seawater via desalination processes into clean drinking water. All of those systems now rely on fuel, and there's a lack of fuel coming. Nothing's coming into Gaza in terms of fuel supply. So now we have less water production taking place. Even the water trucks that move water around within Gaza are now no longer to operate on the same scale as prior to the ceasefire because they don't have access to fuel. The chemicals that are used in water desalination are no longer able to enter Gaza. So people don't have access to food. They have very little access to water, and shelter is still a massive problem. Around 1 million people in Gaza are still in need of tents. So they're sleeping in really unsafe, damaged buildings that have been hit by military violence. Often these buildings are sadly collapsing on top of the people sheltering beneath them. Others are setting up along the side of the road. And they look to humanitarian organizations like ours to ask for assistance, and we're not able to give them anything at this point except to continue to advocate for their rights to be respected.
And I know that sort of organizations like Save the Children have published that there are already people who have died from hunger, from malnutrition. I mean, could you talk about sort of the more extreme element of this? So you're saying sort of for most people, their supplies are massively running down or they're having to beg. I mean, there are presumably some people who, you know, have already passed away through lack of food and water. Could you talk about that, please?
One of the difficult things at the moment is that humanitarian organizations are also being restricted in our ability to move around within Gaza because the Israeli forces are no longer giving us the safety assurances that we used to be able to get prior to the collapse of the ceasefire. What that means is even the malnutrition screenings are not taking place at the same level as they were previously. We're not able to access displacement sites in the same way. So many of the hardest hit people might not have even been identified by the humanitarian actors. And there has been an uptick in malnutrition screening, including including acute malnutrition, which is extremely severe and poses critical risk to the lives of mostly children at this point over the last few weeks. We still don't have access to data. There's ongoing efforts to try and look at the statistics involved, but collecting that information is really difficult. What we can say with clarity is there are people that have zero access to food at this point, and the lives of tens of thousands of people are now at risk if the siege is not lifted.
And of course, what you'd hope with sort of information like this leaking out is that people in Israeli civil society would put pressure on Netanyahu to lift the siege because of how inhumane this obviously is. I mean, instead, it turns out we've heard from Ben Gavir, so a far-right Israeli minister. He was apparently speaking in Mar-a-Lago about what he says is the need to start bombing food depots. So not only should they not allow any food in, but any food that already is within Gaza, they should bomb it. I wondered if you could sort of respond to statements like that from Israeli government ministers.
We've continued to see attacks and we've continued to see airstrikes that have targeted food distribution points over the last month. This is not just an idea, this is a reality here on the ground in Gaza. In the last hour before I began speaking to you, we've had 4 significant airstrikes just here in western Deir al-Balah. These strikes continue to take place, affecting civilian locations across Gaza. But I think it's really important to counter any narrative that suggests there is enough food in Gaza already. That is simply untrue, and it's simply not the case. And every single truck of aid that Israel prevents from entering Gaza at this point now risks becoming a death sentence for the people here who don't have access to any alternatives. And the other thing to consider with Gaza is there used to be an ability to produce some elements of food domestically. The whole eastern side of Gaza and the northern areas, Beit Lahia, Beit Hanun, these are densely agricultural areas that were used to be able to produce fruit and vegetables. But of course, if you look at the way that populations have been forcefully transferred in Gaza, they've been pushed away from the east with this extensive buffer zone now in place, and similarly has taken place in the north. So there's no ability to grow food in Gaza at the same level as previously. Alternatively, you have the fishing sector, which used to be a staple in Gaza. If fishermen enter the sea, they now are being shot at by naval forces. So we've taken away the ability of Palestinians to access food aid. We've taken away the ability of Palestinians to grow their own food. They can't fish for their own food, and the private sector is not able to import food. So all options available to them have been completely and systematically dismantled.
And governments such as the UK's and France have sort of written strongly worded letters to suggest that Israel lifts this siege. What more, from your perspective, should they be doing?
I think it's incredibly disappointing as a European, as a British person, to see how little actual action has been taken by the international community to help Palestinians in Gaza. When I first arrived just over a year ago now, there was some belief that the international community would prevent the worst from happening in Gaza. There was still a belief that the displacement of 1 million people from Rafah wouldn't possibly be allowed to take place. But time after time, we've seen the international community fail to take tangible action in Gaza to protect the lives of civilians and to ensure that their rights are respected and ensure that aid can be delivered. What we need to see now is that tangible action, those setting of red lines that are consistent with international humanitarian law to protect Palestinians.
And I mean, you've suggested it's difficult for you to leave your compound now. I wonder if you could speak to, I mean, we know that aid workers, including international aid workers, have been killed by the Israeli army. Do you feel at risk of your life, or is it really just a question of it really restricting the amount you're allowed to move? What are, I suppose, the Norwegian Refugee Council, what are they telling you? What's the policy when it comes to aid workers?
So at the moment, we're trying to minimize our movement to only be present in sites where the Israeli forces have acknowledged that they are humanitarian facilities. We use a notification system to let them know where our guest houses are, where our warehouses are, where our offices are, and distribution points. What we also used to be able to do is share our movement plans in advance. For example, I'm planning to go to this distribution site tomorrow to visit displaced people, to assess needs and to deliver assistance. And we used to get an acknowledgement from the Israeli forces that they know that movement's taking place. They no longer acknowledge our movements within Gaza. And at the same time as this, we're seeing this massive uptick in bombardment right the way across Gaza. So every single time we get in the car now, you are risking your life to move through an area with incredible rates of military violence and no assurances that the Israeli forces will respect their obligations under international humanitarian law not to target us. There have been more than 400 aid workers killed in Gaza so far, but what's also important to underline is the vast majority of those are Palestinians. There are, of course, privileges to being a European in Gaza, and that is that my death would probably attract a lot more attention than the death of a Palestinian, given we continue to see dozens and dozens of people being killed every day. We continue to see children being disfigured on a daily basis. That's become a normal part of the news cycle. So there are some elements where I feel slightly safer than the average person in Gaza, but at the same time, the violence is so indiscriminate at the moment that the chances of being impacted by this, especially when we've seen these direct attacks on humanitarian facilities where Israel has acknowledged the presence of the aid actors and still hit the compounds anyway, it's a very real fear and it's a very real concern.
I know you work for a humanitarian aid organisation, so I'm not sure sort of how candid you can be when it comes to politics. But I mean, from everything you've described, this does sound, I mean, in a way, like a bit of an end game by the Israelis, where they are trying to destroy the possibility of life in Gaza, and presumably with the hope that this will mean that people sort of have no choice but to beg to leave this strip. I mean, how much can you say about sort of your political assessment of what's going on at the moment?
As a humanitarian organisation, we are neutral, so we don't take sides within a conflict, but we can speak to the humanitarian catastrophe that is unfolding here. And we can say very clearly that the humanitarian needs of Palestinians have been weaponized against them, that we continue to see massive amounts of indiscriminate force being used against civilians in Gaza that are inconsistent with international humanitarian law. And we can speak to the fact that humanitarian organizations have been set up to fail, and we've consistently been prevented by the Israeli government from bringing in enough assistance and getting it to the people who need it. And that's where the role of the international community should be coming into play, where they should be setting those red lines and supporting the international aid response to take place here in Gaza. But unfortunately, we're not seeing that transpire at the moment.
Once upon a time, space exploration was something done by states. In 1957, it was the Soviet satellite Sputnik that was the first to orbit the Earth. 4 years later, it was the Soviet astronaut Yuri Gagarin who became the first human to orbit the Earth. And in 1969, after they were shocked into action, the United States became the first nation to put a man on the moon. More recently, China has joined the ranks of nations that can send people into space, and countries like Japan, India, and the European nations all have unmanned spacecraft. But the big change in the last decade or so is that it's not just states, but wealthy individuals who control the technology needed to access the extraterrestrial. Jeff Bezos has already flown Katy Perry into the outer atmosphere, but it's Elon Musk's SpaceX where the real action is at. SpaceX is, of course, now the world's dominant space launch provider, with its reusable rockets having slashed the cost of sending spacecraft into orbit. And those rockets have been used to launch thousands of Starlink satellites into space. Starlink satellites now make up 60% of all spacecraft in orbit. Really incredible statistic, seeing as they've only been going up there since 2019. And Elon's ambition doesn't end there.
I think we've gotten, at this point, to where the vehicle is very reliable, and we are going to be able to take astronauts to Mars. In fact, we want to take anyone who goes to Mars and ultimately build a self-sustaining civilization on Mars. That is the long-term goal of the company.
So, Elon Musk wants his company to colonize Mars, making SpaceX something like a 21st century East India company, but for outer space. Well, if he does manage to master the technology, and that's a big if, should he even be allowed to do this? Is space a question of first come, first served? Or should we be looking to organize the extraterrestrial commons in a more ordered and egalitarian fashion? Well, that's the question posed by Carla Ibled, a fellow in international political economy at the University of Durham, in a new report for the Commonwealth think tank. I caught up with Carla Ibled earlier today and began by asking her to lay out the current legal framework for who owns what and who has the right to do what in space.
According to international law, space belongs to everyone. So the main there's quite a few treaties, in space law, but the main one is the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. And according to this treaty, space is a province of mankind. And the treaty is quite strict and open about the fact that, space should be free of access to for every state with no restriction. that all areas of celestial bodies should be accessible to, state operators, and also really say really explicitly that basically, appropriation is outlawed.
And so does that mean that the current law would, I suppose, preclude Elon Musk colonizing Mars? He seems to want sort of SpaceX to run its own colony. Under your interpretation of sort of current treaties, would that be something he can't legally do?
The law says that, it bans appropriation of space resources and lands and ban any claim of sovereignty on space lands. So if you think about how claims to private property are often backed by, states, it means that, Elon Musk will not have any grounds for claiming, Martian land for himself. I think there's some debates and it's how, at the moment, the corporate push is trying to, push for appropriation of space resources by stating that actually the treaty says that we cannot appropriate a land, but we can appropriate resources that have been taken away from Mars or from an asteroid. So in a way, I think there's more ground to say that, for instance, we could mine asteroids and appropriate the resources from asteroids, but it's quite, even, very right-wing legal theorists seems to really doubt that there is any ground to claim a territory in itself for one person. So from this perspective, that would make it really difficult for him to create a colony on Mars.
And so is that the reason, as far as I understand, your report is sort of documenting how there are right-wing think tanks who are trying to change the law to try and replace this treaty that was sort of signed by sort of many of the relevant countries in 1967 and try and replace that with something which would be more open to the idea that, if you can get there first, you can claim what's there?
In a way, I think a lot of even the neoliberal think tank kind of agree that it would be really difficult to rewrite international law. So the way they try to work around it is to create precedents. And so from this perspective, they try to create ways of interpreting the law in a different way to allow for, to legalize appropriation of space resources and specifically, in the context of mining. I think only extremists would really try to, push for the, homesteading, which is about appropriating a land through, working it and transforming it, which is basically at the heart, I think, of Elon Musk's claim with terraforming. But, most of it are trying to push for a more sneaky way of reinterpreting the law in their favor, basically.
The terraforming thing, that's kind of the Lockean theory of rights, isn't it? Sort of if you increase the productivity of the land, then you get to sort of reap the rewards from that. How soon is this going to all become relevant? So sort of you've brought up asteroid mining, so the idea that you can go and sort of get valuable minerals, I suppose, from asteroids. Elon Musk talking about terraforming Mars. Are either of these things in your mind sort of things that are in the near future or much further away? Obviously, there's going to be disagreement in the sort of scientific domain about this, but what's your sense here? What should our audience understand?
I think the case of Musk and terraforming is more a PR stance, and I think a lot of people agree that it will not be doable in the near-term future. The one that is more, open to discussion is really the question of space mining, and it's probably slightly easier to, go on an asteroid and bring back, even, a few kilograms of rare earth material are already worth a lot. So I guess, that's probably the kind of use of space that are more likely to occur in a near-time future.
And why should we care? Because, obviously, imperialism on planet Earth, so the colonization of the Americas or Africa, the big problem with that was that there were already people there, right? So land was being stolen from its sort of existing tenants, inhabitants. Presumably, we might be proven wrong, but when it comes to sort of asteroids that we're going to be mining or Mars, there isn't anyone there. So is it not a case where sort of that colonization can actually be done without moral qualms because there's no one there this time around?
Well, there's different ways of answering this question, and I think one of them is really to think about how, what is really interesting with international law on space is that, all these treaties have been trying to create an image of space as the province of mankind. So it's basically conceptualizing space, as a common to humanity. So you could say, to answer your question, that, you would rob all of us by, appropriating these resources, because in a way, they belong to every one of us. And especially if, in a way, we leave this kind of institutional framework be deconstructed, it means that, in effect, what it means is that space will be appropriated on a first come, first served basis, which can only favor people who are really rich enough to be able to go to space. Some of those legal framework, not all of them have been accepted by everybody, but as you were implying, the Outer Space Treaty has been signed by 115 nations, so it's quite significant. But there's one that is signed by less nations, and that is, in my view, quite interesting as well, which is the Moon Agreement, which is signed in the 1970s. And this one is really trying to think and conceptualize and write in the law this kind of principle of redistribution between nations.
I suppose the argument that would be made by, either a private individual like Elon Musk or a nation state like the US or China is they would say, well, if we're going to do this asteroid mining, it's going to be incredibly expensive to get there. It's going to be incredibly expensive to bring it back. So if the moment it sort of arrives back on planet Earth, suddenly these resources which we've mined are common property, no one's going to have any incentive to do it whatsoever. So how would you, is there a balance to be struck whereby there's still an incentive for people to go and get this stuff, but when they bring it back, they don't have 100% rights to it? Should they have 50% rights to it and then the rest gets shared? What's your thoughts on how this could work?
I do understand that there is some scope for public-private partnership, but I think it's really important that we make sure, it's not completely hijacked by the private sector. And that in some ways we can be doubtful about, considering that private actors are motivated by profit making. There's really a question about whether we can trust them to redistribute, the profits created by space in an equitable way. So in a way, I think I understand how, we probably might have to think about, incentives and how to make it worthwhile for private actors to help in this kind of space exploration and conquest. But at the same time, I think it needs to be part of an international project, a collective bargaining project. And I think, the best way to do it is probably through international organization rather than letting, private actors do whatever they want.
That was Carla Ibled speaking to me earlier today. Aaron, if I remember correctly, there's a whole chapter in Fully Automated Luxury Communism on asteroid mining. What's changed since then? I feel like, in things like AI, that's developing super fast. I haven't heard much about asteroid mining in a while. Do you think this is going to be hitting the headlines anytime soon?
Michael, everything I predicted in that book is coming true. Where I was wrong is that things are accelerating more quickly than I expected. There have been developments with regards to space transportation. Obviously, SpaceX is making breakthroughs all the time. A space-based internet is now a thing that you can just buy as a consumer. It wasn't really when I wrote the book. And the talk of sending humans to Mars at some point in the 2030s, I think, is quite likely. The things that have been accomplished before that book was published were really important, though. There was a lander which was launched by the Japanese space agency called Hayabusa. There were 2 Hayabusa missions, 1 and 2. The second one went to an asteroid, got a deposit of that asteroid, came back to Earth. So the technology to, quote unquote, mine asteroids exists. Is it, of a sufficient scale and sufficiently cheap to make it worthwhile for market actors? No. But that's coming. And this is really important, Michael, for all the reasons your guest just said a moment ago. But also, on top of that, we are talking here about almost unimaginable wealth, unimaginable resources. People like Peter Diamandis have talked about, in Silicon Valley circles, they've said the first trillionaire will be in space. You've got that great quote from Mark Cuban saying the first trillionaire will be in AI. You've got Peter Diamandis saying the first trillionaire will be in the space exploration industries. and you've got Elon Musk trying to get in both places. I'll give you one example. There's an asteroid, and this is from the book. You should buy it. Fully automated electric companies. There's an asteroid called 16 Psyche, located in the belt between Mars and Jupiter, measures over 200 kilometers in diameter. It's one of the largest asteroids in our solar system. It's composed of iron, nickel, copper, gold, platinum, and its estimated value, and this is just absurd, its estimated value in terms of raw materials is $10,000 quadrillion, and that's just the iron. Okay. Now, this is really interesting because what this technology of asteroid mining, which is going to happen, it's a question of when. Is it 10 years? Is it 110 years? But what it will make possible is unimaginable access to critical mineral resources. Now, of course, if you got that kind of resource wealth overnight and you had access to it, what would happen? You would collapse the value of resources. You'd effectively have post-scarcity iron, right? We're talking about $10,000 quadrillion just in iron from one asteroid. You've collapsed the value of iron. Iron is like, it's cheaper than, water is on Earth right now. So what would you get? I suspect you would have price fixing, you would have monopolistic practices, and so you'd have extraordinary abundance, but in order for some people to make money, the imposition of artificial scarcity. Now, the counter-argument historically from capitalists would be, well, if you didn't have the artificial scarcity, then the incentives to get the stuff wouldn't be there. Unless, of course, you have this being undertaken by forces, actors beyond the market. I personally think there probably is some space for market actors in all of this. In terms of critical minerals, though, in terms of things like gold, etc., I think they should be divided up in an equitable way amongst the world's peoples, fundamentally. The starting point for all of this, Michael, is going to be the generation of off-world fuel. Now, again, I said this all in my book, published, I think, in 2019? People were laughing. People were genuine. This guy's crazy. He's ridiculous. Guido Fawkes' Order did, lampooned me, Corbynites in space, me and Matt Zarb as astronauts. Well, the world's wealthiest person is taking it very seriously, actually. The Chinese, the Japanese are taking it very seriously. Hey, maybe you know what? As people in the UK and as Europeans as well, maybe we should take this stuff seriously too, rather than trying to get some retweets and likes. This is happening. Do we want to be a part of it? And that was one of the things I was trying to get at in the book. I think that this starts with off-world fuel. What do you need to make fuel? You need hydrogen and oxygen. A big part of that is going to be turning the ice, which we've known is present on the moon since, I think, 2008, 2009, confirmed. There's ice on Mars. There's ice on a ton of asteroids too. What that means is you can turn those places into effectively, as the Americans call them, gas stations, petrol stations. If you can generate water there and you can generate a form of gas from that water by mixing elements of CO2 with elements of the water, because like I say, you need hydrogen and oxygen, then you can make gas. And then you begin to build a self-sustaining infrastructure that allows asteroid mining down the line. That's where this is going to start. And so I suspect the first step for somebody like Elon Musk with regards to all of this and trying to win property rights of resources, off planet, will be accessing deposits of ice on the moon. But I think probably more likely and easier is going to be on certain asteroids. And you're going to have specific asteroids in specific places, which are very convenient, very nicely located, and will be of immense value in the future, right? Whether that's 50 or 100 years' time, they'll be immensely valuable in the future as quote-unquote gas stations for this off-world mining industry. Look, we're socialists. We're meant to be interested in technology. We're meant to be interested in the future of our species, how we can overcome the problems of scarcity. That's literally the basis of my politics. I think we need to start thinking seriously about this stuff.
Yeah, I suppose for me, the thing I mean, it's been a while since I've read your book, so maybe you'll answer it in the chapter and I've forgotten it. But the thing that sort of doesn't quite click for me with asteroid mining is that, in a way, the cost of most of these items is the cost of extracting them, right? So we're not really short of iron in the world. Sort of the price of iron is generally sort of the price of extracting the iron from the ground. So it's only going to be sort of revolutionary and transformational if it becomes cheaper to extract iron from an asteroid than it is to extract it from the Earth.
Yeah.
And that to me seems way up. The idea that we could get loads of iron from the asteroid and bring it back here, but I'm not actually sure the bottleneck in many industries is that there is a physical sort of scarcity of that item on planet Earth. It's just that it costs a bit to extract it. So until we actually run out of any of these things on Earth, the incentive to go there and get it from space to me is not obvious.
So you're thinking too small, Michael. The iron that would be extracted from asteroids, that, by the way, they wouldn't be going to the asteroid coming back. Some of these larger asteroids, I think it makes perfect sense to effectively turn those into vessels of some kind, bringing them closer into Earth orbit. That, I think, is what's going to happen. So you're going to have these huge lumps of floating metal in our solar system, and that's basically what many asteroids are, along with ice, effectively, like I say, a form of gas, if you want it to be. They're going to be brought closer into the Earth's orbit. And yes, you're not going to mine those for many materials, though you will for some to bring back to Earth. But that will be the basis of the construction industry off-world, Michael. So yes, we don't need to bring iron from an asteroid back to Earth because iron here is so cheap. But if you want to start building infrastructure on Mars, actually it makes a hell of a lot of sense to source it from asteroids rather than getting it here. And I think once you have the cost of space transportation continuing to fall to such an extent that you are having regular journeys between Mars and Earth, actually stopping off somewhere to be able to get 10,000 tons of palladium or gold is perfectly economic, in fact. So the numbers will add up. For something like iron and using it on Earth and bringing it from an asteroid, of course, you're absolutely right. But for other materials, no, there's a real value here. But like you say, iron, we're going to need a ton of it. We're not going to be mining Earth. We're not going to be mining iron, steel, things like that on Earth, sending it into space. That's lunacy. That stuff will be accessed from asteroids. By the way, Michael, it's not just gold and palladium, diamonds, hugely valuable commodity resources are littered across our solar system. There's a great quote, I put it in the book, again from Peter Diamandis. Our planet, the Earth, is a crumb in a supermarket when it comes to natural resources. And once we have the ability to send vehicles from our planet at a pretty low cost, and the cost has collapsed in the last 15 years, Michael, at a pretty low cost, and to be able to come back, ultimately you're going to use a lot of automated labor to keep costs very low. A lot of that mineral wealth is going to be accessible to humanity. The question is, who benefits? That's the question. Who benefits? What will it be used for? Now, I think that's an argument for some kind of social ownership. Even if you disagree, I think you have to argue for pretty high rates of incidental taxation, for instance, on the resources being accessed. I personally would like to see something like a Norway option with regards to those mineral resources. I think that Norway's done incredibly well out of public ownership of its hydrocarbon wealth in the North Sea over the last 40 years. I think humanity could and should do something similar with regards to off-world mineral resources. Being realistic, you might have a mix of the two, some private, some public. But I think where we're going, the trajectory right now is something entirely different, which is we create a world of multi-trillionaires while some people can't even access clean drinking water. That is the world we already live in, by the way. And I think because of the operating system of capitalism, even if you can access the kind of abundance I talk about in the book, Elon Musk is perfectly aware of with regards to asteroid mining, even then, with the operating system of capitalism, you're going to still have incredibly poor people unable to access clean drinking water, medicines, unable to read and write, etc. And so I think that's the conversation to have. We have tremendous abundance potentially accessible to us. I think it's a matter of when, not if. Who benefits?
And I suppose for me, what's the point? I see I get your argument, right? You're not going to be bringing iron back from the asteroid to Earth. You might be mining the iron on a different planet or on a asteroid so that you can build interstellar industries or transport or whatever. How is that going to benefit most people? Because I suppose for me, the most obvious reason why like Elon might want to go to Mars is so that he can be a god there. And if it all goes to shit on Earth, he can leave, 8 billion of us here and go up there with, various women that he can mate with or whatever. I don't know. I struggle to imagine the future where interstellar travel is benefiting the ordinary man and woman on Earth.
Or you could say the exact same thing about what happens after 1492. Obviously, Europeans did not discover the Americas in 1492. It's occupied by people long before that. And in fact, the first Europeans on the North American continent are almost certainly, well, not almost certainly, certainly Nordic people like Leif Anderson and whatnot, Leif Erikson rather. So I think it's the exact same thing there, Michael. If you're a European, imagine you're from Genoa, amazing city in the early 15th century, or you're a Spaniard, or you're from Plymouth in England. These are all highly developed, sophisticated societies. You have access to food, you have access to culture, basic social infrastructure. There is absolutely no need. There's no need for those people to go to what is the Western Hemisphere and to ultimately occupy the Americas. Why do they ultimately do it? Columbus obviously is initially trying to go for certain reasons, but the reason why they ultimately do it is to access capital. Two forms of capital ultimately, but the one that really changes everything is gold. All of a sudden you start to get massive amounts of gold and silver, actually, to be honest, from South America. So, I mean, it's the exact same logic, right? You could say, well, Europeans didn't need that. And actually, we know that the infusion of gold from the Western Hemisphere into Europe completely changes the economics of Europe after the 15th century. I suspect something similar might happen with Earth and asteroid mining. You're saying why? I mean, you can say why for lots of things. Why did Leif Erikson go to North America? Why did Columbus go to North America? Why do people do lots of good things? Why do the Dutch go across the Cape of Good Hope? Why do people do lots of things? Ultimately, partly about exploration, partly about making money. But in the sort of thought architecture of somebody like Elon Musk in 2025, let's try and embed it right now in this contemporary conversation, having mining rights and land rights in terms of quote unquote future gas stations, asteroids with deposits of ice on them, those places on paper are just very valuable. If you have the chance of getting it before anybody else does, you're going to take it, right? And humans, by the way, have done that for a very long time, particularly Europeans have done that across the planet. Actually, quite recently, when you think about places like Australasia as well as North America. So I don't think it's anything new, and I don't think it's kind of at odds with historical precedent.
The debate over trans people and what toilets they can use is still raging and has provoked a very interesting exchange between former Tory Minister Simon Clarke and Labour's Dawn Butler.
I think if you look at Bridget Phillickson's interview with Times Radio, sorry for mentioning a rival show, in
We're confident enough.
June last year, quite right, where she was saying that under her preferred interpretation of the law, trans women should use women's bathrooms. That wasn't the position she was adopting during the election campaign. And the reality is Labour shadow ministers, as they then were repeatedly unable to give a straight answer to the question of both what is a woman and whether trans women should be using women's only spaces. In that sense, I'm afraid, it just doesn't wash to say that there has been consistency because there hasn't been.
Right, but there has been. And what we have to do now is talk about the protections of trans women and trans men who are often left out of the debate. And actually, I think within this debate, I actually think we shouldn't have debates anymore without a trans man or a trans woman being included in the debate, because it's always talking about them without them. And in regards to bathrooms, which is always this sort of vexed issue, what really concerns me is that, trans women should, in my opinion, of course, still continue to use women's bathrooms. They can't.
That's literally not what the law says.
But let me just
that's the whole point
talk
of this
through.
ruling.
So I'm just going to pause there because I want you to know how confident, I suppose, Simon Clarke seems on this issue. He's saying, look, Labour, they were completely incoherent. They said one thing, then they said another. There's no consistency here. By the way, he is right on that point. And then sort of when it comes to what this Supreme Court ruling means, he's sort of like, I know exactly what's going on here, just exuding confidence. But look at what happens next, because I think Dawn Butler sort of talks about the actual issue, not just political point scoring, and he doesn't any longer seem quite so confident.
Safe spaces, there's not been a safe space is a safe space. I do not police people in public toilets. And I think that's where we're getting to as society, in policing what a woman looks like. You know, I have a butch lesbian friend who gets hounded out of women's toilets, and it is heartbreaking to the point where we have to escort her into the toilet because she's going to be hounded out, and we need to stop that. And what concerns me about the toilet debate is if trans men then have to use women's toilets, that's going to make women less safe, because how are you going to stop a normal man going into a woman's toilets and saying, I'm a trans man? And so I think we have to look at
I don't follow that logic.
Why?
Because the point is that we're saying that people who are biologically men shouldn't be using women's toilets. That's the point of this ruling, among other things.
But a trans man is biologically a woman.
Someone who's transitioned from being a woman to a man is...
And so they would then have to use women's toilets.
I think this...
And that's the problem. That is the problem, and that's what concerns me.
I'll be honest, this is something that we can talk about an awful lot more and debate an awful lot more. And I thank both of you for doing it in a respectful way.
Yeah, it's a genuinely contentious one.
Yeah, let's go to the break now. Really interesting to get your views on this as well.
I thought my phone had broken for a moment when I first watched that, because the silence just lasts such a long time. And I have to say, I don't judge anyone for not knowing exactly what they think about this, right? I don't judge anyone for thinking, oh, this is taking me a while to sort of work out and sort of think about the consequences and the implications here. Totally reasonable. But I do think it's problematic if you're sort of putting forward this view of, this is really simple, this has always been very simple. I don't know why Keir Starmer and Bridget Phillipson couldn't have just said trans women aren't women last year, and why we had to wait for the Supreme Court, just sort of making it seem like this was all so obvious. I know exactly what's going on. I understand the Supreme Court ruling, and by the way, I support it. And then sort of you get this example, which isn't a particularly complex one, and you're sort of flummoxed. Oh, hadn't really thought about that. And maybe that should, I suppose, put in doubt your confidence that you were exuding in the first part of the conversation. Simon Clarke might not have thought about the scenario suggested by Dawn Butler, which will presumably now be a common one. Someone who has, though, is the gender-critical campaigner Maya Forstater. She's the CEO of Sex Matters, which was one of the 4 groups allowed to give evidence to the Supreme Court on the question of where trans men should go to the toilet. She tweeted this: there are often unisex options. Not being allowed into the men's by rule does not mean you have the right to go into the ladies, and vice versa. So she's saying, just because you can't go into the men's because you're a trans man and they no longer want people, they think people should not be able to go to the toilet of their acquired sex, that doesn't mean you have the right to go into the toilet of your birth sex. So you can go to neither toilet. And she says that may seem unfair, but these are life choices people make. If you make extreme efforts to look like a man, don't be surprised if you are denied entrance to ladies. Now, I think this is really, really clarifying as a tweet. Because of, well, one, I think it's quite cruel, right, to suggest that you can't use the men's or the ladies. So sometimes there are unisex options, but what if there aren't? But more, I think it's this point, these are life choices people make. And in a way, I actually, I've spoken about this on previous shows, I think this is sort of somewhere where the trans movement missed a trick, because they didn't push back against the idea that this is a choice. Because I think there's a sort of postmodernism on the left where you don't want anything to be, I was born this way, right? I think I'm gay because I was born that way. And I've often sort of had a conversation when it comes to trans people. Well, I think it's you're born this way. It's not a choice. So even if it does cause some complications, I was thinking about this with gay people, because so much of this is about change rooms and toilets, right? The argument is that these should be separate because people might feel uncomfortable. There's differences in strength or whatever. I mean, you can have exactly the same argument about gay people, right? If you say the reason we have male and female toilets is because you don't want to go to the toilet or change or have a shower in front of someone who is sexually attracted to you. Now, obviously, gay people massively complicate that, right? If a man is in a group changing room with me at a gym, then they are in the gym. They might be getting undressed in front of someone who might plausibly be attracted to them, right? And people did used to have that argument about gay people. So it does, the existence of gay people does create a complication. And people used to say, well, why should we suffer this complication? You chose to be gay. This is your lifestyle choice. Therefore, you need to use some kind of third space. You need to get out of this toilet, or you need to just stop being gay, which I think was normally the argument being made. But then gay people very effectively said, we can't stop being gay. We were born this way, which is why I think that argument should be made much more strongly when it comes to trans people. We were born this way. This is not a choice. I think that could, I suppose, make some progress here. Not that I think it would ever persuade Maya Forstater, but there are lots of people in the middle. Aaron, what did you make of that clip? A very long period of silence there.
Yeah, embarrassing, isn't it? I mean, I agree with you that just because somebody hasn't worked out the full complications of their own conclusions, rather, of their own viewpoint, doesn't mean you should sort of mock and deride them. But this person was a former MP. He wasn't just a former MP, he was a very senior member of a Tory cabinet. You know, it's not Barry or Jack or Jill off the street, okay? There should be, I think, a higher threshold of critique with regards to regular people. I think with a politician, if you're that dozy about such a big issue where you have such certainty, you should effectively be laughed at. I think, my view, Michael. I think you made a really great set of points. What I'd say to people who are watching or listening who are skeptical of trans people being able to access bathroom spaces, as one example, accessing bathroom spaces that they would like to, that are congruent with the gender they have chosen to live in and with, they would say, well, you know, this is about safeguarding. Here's the question for those people, precisely those people. You want to keep potentially violent straight men who are attracted to women, cis straight men who are attracted to women, from exploiting, as you see it, a loophole, okay, which allows certain people who aren't born as women into women toilets. You want that as a safeguarding issue to be taken seriously, and therefore certain people cannot be allowed to have access to the toilets. Now, what is more likely to maximize the safety of those women? Is it going to be admonishing and isolating trans women? Or actually, is it going to be saying those people are more than welcome? Because who is going to take advantage of that situation? There are trans men out there, Michael. I've met them. I have friends that are trans men who look the same as you and me. 100 out of 100 people will say they are men. Okay? So if you are a man who looks like you and me, facial hair, etc., and you want to take advantage of that situation, then actually, Dawn Butler's point is on the money, right? I do find it remarkable these things weren't really in circulation in terms of the broader public debate and in the media. But I have to say, Michael, the quality of the debate on this stuff has been so poor. Good people, well-intentioned people have not been exposed to the kinds of simple, logical arguments that they should have been. And obviously, I put a significant amount of that down to the media. Even, Michael, the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, in the aftermath of the Supreme Court's ruling, which is only about the Equality Act, okay? The Equality Act 2010. For the sake of the Equality Act, a woman is defined as a biological woman who's born as a woman. However, we have an antecedent point of legislation from 2004, which allows people to change their gender with a gender recognition certificate. That is still on the statute books. That is still the law. You have the Prime Minister basically saying that law doesn't exist anymore. We don't, the Supreme Court decided this. The Supreme Court decided it in relation to that particular piece of legislation in 2010. There's another bit of legislation which actually is completely conflicting with what you're saying. And Michael, when you have even the Prime Minister saying something which is factually incorrect, you don't have to like it or dislike it. You might want to repeal the 2004 legislation. The godmother of my daughter actually is a trans woman, and they have a gender recognition certificate. I obviously don't want to repeal it, but you might want to repeal the legislation. It is the legislation. It is the law. And we have a Prime Minister, the person who's literally at the apex of elected power in this country, making that more ambiguous and doing the opposite of what they should be doing, which is actually clarifying the law. And so I think for me, Michael, this is really totemic of, like I say, the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years just being an absolute shit show in terms of clarifying and offering a productive debate. We've not had that. We've not had that for whatever reason. I blame principally the media, because with the media, Michael, with legacy media, conflict sells, conflict works. And sometimes when you're trying to generate a productive conversation, you don't want conflict. You don't want polarization. You want people to listen to other points of view, and maybe you come at some kind of consensus, which most people agree on most of the time. That is not in the interest of legacy media, particularly broadcast and the newspapers. But hopefully we can begin to get some sense and some reasonability into this conversation. Here's hoping. I mean, we really need it, Michael, frankly, in our politics more widely. And I think you've been brilliant on this. You've been brilliant, Michael. Let me say that. Because, I don't think enough people give Michael Walker his flowers. You are always looking for a productive consensus, and you don't like polarizing for the sake of polarization. And you know what? Sometimes that's what's needed, but it doesn't pay the bills. Polarization is a very lucrative business, let me tell you. Michael Walker tries to find the clarity and the facts through all of it, like Moses going through the Red Sea. And I'm very grateful to work with you as a result, Michael. But sadly, that is not the norm in our industry.
Oh, you're making me blush now. We're 10 minutes over time as well, so we're going to have to wrap up. That's very kind of you, though. Thank you so much. Have an especially good weekend this time, Aaron.
I'll try my best, Michael.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Come back on Monday for another live show at 6 p.m. Until then, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.